When communists defeated the French colonists in North Vietnam in 1954, the U.S. sent military operatives to reinforce the anti-communist government in South Vietnam. The Soviet Union and China sent assistance to North Vietnam. The Communist North Vietnamese government vowed to unite the entire country under its rule. Eventually, assassinations and terrorism by the North Vietnamese increased in South Vietnam. Though the South Vietnamese government was not communist, it was corrupt. As its leaders engaged in bribery, extortion, and theft, the social services for average people deteriorated. The president of South Vietnam, Ngo Dinh Diem, and his family were widely disliked. Many within the majority Buddhist country felt detached from the Diem family, who were Catholic. President Diem imposed policies discriminating against Buddhists and favoring Catholics. When Buddhists protested, they were met with police violence. In June of 1963, a Buddhist monk, Thich Quang Duc, set himself on fire in protest of Ngo Dinh Diem's policies. Other monks and at least one nun did the same. Many professionals and students joined the Buddhist protest. On November 2, 1963, President Diem was assassinated by South Vietnamese generals operating with the approval of the United States, and a new military government was formed. President John F. Kennedy was assassinated in the United States a few weeks later. In 1964, Lyndon B. Johnson was elected as the President of the United States. With the shaky state of the South Vietnamese government and the North Vietnamese close to victory, his administration was desperate. Without addressing Congress or receiving a legislative declaration of war, Johnson authorized the deployment of 100,000 troops to Vietnam in 1965 and another 100,000 troops in 1966. The conservative response to the war was conflicted. William F. Buckley observed that to win a war in Vietnam would require far more resources and bloodshed than the American people would tolerate. However, to withdraw from the country would represent an embarrassing defeat to communism. Conservatives criticized the assassination of President Diem, who they claimed was the legitimate leader of South Vietnam. Without his leadership, some believed that no amount of force would be enough to win the war. Additionally, they believed that President Johnson's desperation to reach a settlement gave communists an advantage and caused a drawn-out, protracted battle. In the conservatives' opinion, the only hope for victory was an all-out war effort. In 1968, James Burnham pointed out that while the communists were planning to achieve victory, the United States was debating only how to get out. The war provided an issue around which conservatives could keep their base engaged. In 1960, a conservative student organization named Young Americans for Freedom was founded. Through this organization and the John Birch Society, which was formed in 1958, conservatives held their movement together after Barry Goldwater's crushing electoral defeat. When the situation in Vietnam worsened, conservatives complained that Johnson was not doing enough to win the war. They called for him to attack Vietnamese communist bases in North Vietnam and Cambodia. William F. Buckley suggested the administration explore using nuclear weapons. Conservatives began to resist calls from military leaders for more troops. Not only did drafting more soldiers energize the leftist anti-war protest, but conservatives also began to sense that these requests were used as a substitute for better military strategy. Ultimately, Johnson did not take conservative suggestions in Vietnam. At the end of his administration, he publicly called for peace talks and announced he would not seek re-election.
In recent years, crime in this country has grown 9 times as fast as population. At the current rate, the crimes of violence in America will double by 1972. We cannot accept that kind of future for America. We owe it to the decent and law-abiding citizens of America to take the offensive against the criminal forces that threaten their peace and their security, and to rebuild respect for law across this country. I pledge to you, the wave of crime is not going to be the wave of the future in America.
Conservatives continue to insist that the war could be won. Richard Nixon won the 1968 presidential election by promising conservatives an honorable settlement in Vietnam, which would preserve as much of America's reputation as possible. He claimed that he had a secret plan to end the war. Republicans nominated him instead of Ronald Reagan, who was then governor of California and a prominent figure in conservative politics, because Nixon, as a former vice president, had more foreign policy experience. By the time Nixon entered office, conservatives were tired of defending the war effort. Pro-war conservatives wanted Nixon to adopt their military proposals and end the war within 6 months. Nixon unveiled a plan to turn over control to South Vietnamese forces on the ground, a process he called Vietnamization. This plan also included the withdrawal of some U.S. troops. Nixon also accepted the call from conservatives to bomb North Vietnamese assets in Cambodia near Vietnam's border. Before the bombing could take place, the plan was leaked to the New York Times. Furious about the press leak, Nixon began taking measures to prevent future security breaches and identify disloyal members of his cabinet. These actions would lead to his resignation years later. Several crises complicated Nixon's attempts to appease conservatives and end the Vietnam War. At the end of 1969, the press revealed that American soldiers had massacred hundreds of unarmed people in Vietnam's Quang Ngai province. In 1970, 4 students were killed at Kent State University in Ohio by National Guardsmen while protesting the bombing in Cambodia and the war in Vietnam. The conduct of the American military abroad and at home was building opposition to the war and making it difficult to go all out. Anti-war sentiment even began to emerge within the conservative coalition. At the August 1969 Young Americans for Freedom Convention, some libertarians burned their draft cards and walked out.
The immediate cause of my defection from the right was Vietnam. Conservatives like me had spent our lives arguing against federal power with one exception. We trusted Washington with enormous powers to fight global communism. We were wrong.
Whatever libertarian elements had been in the fusion have one by one disappeared.
Libertarians began to adopt the New Left's opposition to the Vietnam War as an extension of their views on limited government. These libertarians tended to be less religious, less opposed to drug use, and more accepting of the free love movement. Paleoconservatives were a useful part of the conservative grassroots organizations, but were written off as fringe conspiracy theorists when it came to public policy. Libertarians, however, were present on campuses around the country, and libertarian intellectuals were popular through their collaborations within the larger conservative movement. Libertarianism represented the last conservative opposition to interventionist communism. When President Nixon announced his plan to withdraw troops from Vietnam, there were mixed reactions amongst non-libertarian conservatives. Many of them felt that the anti-war movement was less about ideology and more about young people's fears of being drafted. Conservatives also conceded that inequalities within the draft system politically benefited the anti-war left. Before draft policies were changed, local draft boards had enormous discretion over who would eventually be drafted. Men with political connections or men who were enrolled in college for any field of study could get draft deferments. In practice, this meant that poor whites and ethnic minorities were sent to Vietnam more often. Conservatives hoped that troop withdrawals and draft reforms would stifle anti-war protests and buy more time to pursue other military tactics. But other conservatives saw the withdrawals as a violation of the all-out war strategy, which they believed was necessary to win. Backlash against the Cambodian bombings was so great that Nixon stopped the military campaign after only 2 months. The shortened bombing campaign and the troop withdrawal led to a collapse in morale for the soldiers that remained. Drug use, desertions, and violence increased as soldiers realized the war was futile. Conservatives also accused the liberal media of biased negative reporting, which omitted facts that may have been in favor of the war effort. They believed that once the public turned against the war, this all but guaranteed a defeat. As the foreign policy failures in Vietnam increased, conservative activists tried to focus on other issues until they could find a new way to unify their movement. In 1972, President Nixon visited China, legitimizing the nation for the first time since its communist revolution. Conservatives firmly turned against him. In 1973, Congress overrode President Nixon's veto and passed the War Powers Act, which prohibited any U.S. military operation in and over Indochina after August of that year. Afterwards, American involvement in Vietnam would steadily decline. On July 2, 1976, Vietnam was united under a military government and called the Socialist Republic of Vietnam.
First, the nation should not pursue an objective if it is unwilling to use sufficient means to accomplish the objective. Second, when fighting an enemy committed to a political objective, a strategy of incremental escalation does not work. Third, the United States military needs a suitable doctrine to fight in revolutionary wars of liberation. Fourth, such wars are better fought by professional soldiers rather than a conscript army. Fifth, when a great power fights a minor power or group, it should use overwhelming force at the outset of the conflict to paralyze the enemy and accomplish the objective with less bloodshed and at lesser cost. 6. A nation should not enter a military conflict if it determines that the risk of escalation in the global political context is too great.
In 1971, some libertarians left conservative organizations and created the Libertarian Party. With anti-war paleoconservatives and libertarians gone or marginalized, interventionists were allowed to believe that the failures of the Vietnam War were caused primarily by bad strategy and not by any ideological shortcomings. These beliefs only became more entrenched as America shifted its focus to a new region of the world.